My husband's hand found mine under the table so fast I nearly knocked over my glass. His grip wasn't gentle. It wasn't loving. It was the kind of grip a man gives you right before he tells you something has gone terribly wrong. "We need to go," he said, low, close to my ear. "Now." I laughed it off at first. Told him to wait, that we hadn't even had cake yet, that Charisse would notice if we slipped out early from her own birthday party. He didn't laugh back. He didn't even look at me the way he usually does when I tease him. His jaw was tight. His eyes kept cutting toward the hallway near the coat room, like he was expecting someone to come around that corner. I should tell you who I am before I go any further, because what happened that night changed the way I see my whole family, and you deserve to know whose eyes you're seeing it through. My name is Talia Boswick. I've been married to my husband, Caleb, for 31 years. Our son, Thurman, is the reason we were even at that party. His wife, Charisse, had thrown herself a birthday celebration big enough to fill half the restoration company's client list. Caterers in white gloves, a jazz trio in the corner, the whole uptown crowd dressed like it was a gala instead of a Tuesday night dinner. I want you to comment below and tell me, is anyone else watching this at night after everybody in the house is finally asleep? I do my best thinking after midnight, and something tells me a lot of you do too. Caleb had stepped away maybe 15 minutes before that grip on my hand. Said he needed some air or the restroom. I don't fully remember which excuse he used because I wasn't paying close attention. I was watching Charisse work the room the way she always does, touching arms, laughing at just the right volume. The perfect hostess. I remember thinking, not for the first time, how good she was at making people feel like the only person in the room. When Caleb came back, something in him had changed. Not dramatically, not in a way anyone else at that party would have noticed. But I've been married to that man long enough to know every version of his face, and the one he wore walking back to our table wasn't one I recognized. He didn't sit down. He bent low, took my hand, and said it again. "We need to go. Now, Talia." I asked him what was wrong. He didn't answer. He pulled my chair back himself, said a quick, stiff goodbye to the closest cluster of guests, something about an early morning, and had my coat over my shoulders before I could even find my purse. I caught a glimpse of Thurman near the dessert table as we passed, and for half a second, our eyes met. He smiled at me. It was a good smile, practiced, the kind you give a room full of people who are watching you. Charisse caught us at the door, all warmth, kissing my cheek, thanking us for coming, telling Caleb how much it meant that we made it out. He said something polite back. I don't remember what. My mind had already started running through everything that could make a man like my husband go pale in the middle of his daughter-in-law's birthday party. In the car, I asked him twice what happened. Both times, nothing. Just his hands tight on the wheel and his eyes fixed straight ahead, like he was replaying something over and over that he couldn't yet put into words. I didn't know it then, but the silence in that car was about to become the loudest thing I'd ever heard. Caleb didn't say one word the whole ride home, not when I asked him again at the red light on St. Charles, not when I reached over and touched his arm, hoping the contact might loosen whatever was locked so tight in his jaw. He just drove, both hands on the wheel, eyes fixed somewhere past the windshield that had nothing to do with the road. I've known that man since I was 22 years old. I've seen him angry, seen him scared, seen him grieve his own father at a graveside in the rain without shedding a single tear until we got back to the car. I had never seen whatever this was. We pulled into the driveway, and he cut the engine but didn't move. Just sat there, hands still on the wheel, like he was working up to something. I unbuckled my seatbelt and waited. Inside our own kitchen, under our own light. He finally turned to face me. "You didn't actually see it, did you?" I told him I didn't know what he meant. "See what?" He rubbed his hand down his face, the way he does when he's about to say something he wishes wasn't true, and then he told me. He said he'd stepped away from the party to find a restroom and ended up near the coat room instead. And that's where he saw Charisse, with her hand twisted so tight into Thurman's tie, it had pulled the knot sideways against his throat. He said Thurman wasn't fighting her off. He was apologizing. Over and over, barely above a whisper, shoulders curled in like he was trying to disappear. Caleb said he'd never seen his son's hands shake like that. I felt my stomach drop, but I told myself there had to be an explanation. Maybe they were arguing about something small. Maybe it looked worse than it was. Caleb shook his head before I even finished the thought. "That's not all," he said. He told me he caught Thurman alone for a few seconds right after, before our son had time to put his face back together, and he asked him straight out what that was. He said Thurman broke, right there in that hallway. With the party still going on 20 feet away, our son told him everything in a rushed, terrified whisper. A debt from 3 years back that he never told either of us about. Money he pulled from the business to cover it. And Charisse finding proof of it 2 years ago and never letting him forget it since. I asked him what he meant by never letting him forget it. Caleb's voice went flat in a way that scared me more than if he'd shouted. He said Charisse has been using it against him this whole time, controlling the money that's supposed to be his, deciding who he can see and when. And when words alone don't work fast enough, apparently she reminds him with her hands. I sat down at our kitchen table because my legs weren't sure they wanted to hold me. 2 years. 2 years of Sunday dinners where Thurman seemed a little quieter than he used to be. And I told myself that was just marriage settling in. 2 years of last-minute cancellations I never questioned twice. 2 years I was living 20 minutes away from my own son being afraid in his own home, and I never once let myself look closely enough to see it. Caleb was still talking, saying something about what to do next, but I wasn't fully hearing him anymore. I kept thinking about Thurman's face at the dessert table, that smile he gave me right before we left. Practiced, performed, for me. Long after Caleb had finally gone quiet beside me in bed, I lay awake with my eyes open in the dark, running through 2 years of dinners and phone calls and canceled plans, searching every single one of them for the signs I'd missed. Somewhere close to 5 in the morning, I gave up trying to sleep and reached for my phone on the nightstand instead. I called Thurman before I even finished my coffee, using an excuse I'd used 100 times before, asking if he wanted me to save him a plate from a dish I hadn't even started cooking yet. Caleb sat across from me at the table, arms crossed, telling me under his breath that we should be driving straight to their house instead of calling like everything was normal. I shook my head at him. If we showed up unannounced, angry, asking questions we didn't have proof for yet, we'd hand Charisse every advantage. She'd know exactly what we knew and exactly how much time she had to cover it. A phone call wouldn't spook anybody. Thurman picked up on the 4th ring, and something in his voice was off before he even said a full sentence. Short, clipped, like a man answering a call he didn't have the energy for. "Hey, Ma, can't really talk long." I asked him if everything was all right, keeping my voice light, the same tone I'd use on any Tuesday morning. He said he was fine, just busy. A job walkthrough later that morning for the restoration crew. I asked about the party, told him it looked like everyone had a wonderful time, tried to feel out whether he'd say anything about the hallway on his own. He didn't. He said the party was good. Charisse worked hard on it. His voice went a little flatter saying her name. But I couldn't have told you in that moment whether that meant anything or whether I was just hearing what I already knew to listen for. Caleb mouthed something at me across the table, Ask him straight out. And I held up a hand to stop him. Not yet. I asked Thurman, casual as I could make it, if he wanted to come by Sunday like always. There was a pause before he answered, longer than it should have taken for a simple yes or no. I'll have to check with Sharice first. She keeps up with my schedule pretty close these days. I asked, easy as I could, what that meant exactly. He gave a short laugh that didn't sound like one. She just likes knowing where I am, I guess. Handles the calendar. Half the time she's got my phone anyway. I asked why that was, still keeping my voice light. There was a pause before he answered. Says it's easier that way. Keeps things organized. Knows who's calling and when, so I don't have to think about it. He said it so easily, so naturally, like it was the most unremarkable thing in the world for a grown man to need his wife's approval, to see his own mother. I let it pass in the moment, said something about how thoughtful that was of her, how nice it must be to have someone keeping track of things for him. I didn't want him to hear anything in my voice that would make him regret telling me even that much. But sitting there at my own kitchen table, I felt that detail settle into me like a stone dropping through water, each piece of it landing separately. She keeps the calendar. She's got his phone. She knows who calls and when. None of it sounded like much on its own, if you weren't already looking for what it might mean. I asked him one more question, something about whether he was doing all right, really all right. And I heard it before he said anything. A door somewhere behind him, opening. I have to go, he said, fast, all the air gone out of his voice. I'll call you later, Ma. The line went dead before I could say goodbye. I set the phone down, slow, my hand not quite steady. Caleb was watching me from across the table, and I didn't have to say a word for him to know something in that call had confirmed exactly what he was afraid of. He wanted to drive over there right then. I told him no, not yet. Not until we knew more than a feeling and a phone call cut short. He didn't like it. Neither did I. But we agreed, uneasy and quiet in our own kitchen, to wait and watch a little longer before we did anything either of us couldn't take back. I was looking for a recipe card the next afternoon, digging through an old shoebox of family photos I keep meaning to organize, when I found a picture from Thurman's 30th birthday that stopped me cold. It wasn't a bad picture. Sharice had her arm looped through his, both of them smiling for whoever was holding the camera. I remembered taking that photo myself, remembered writing on the back of it later that night, the way I do with all of them. Thurman's 30th, happiest I've seen him in years. I'd believed that when I wrote it. Looking at it now, 2 years later, I saw something in his eyes I hadn't let myself see the first time. He wasn't looking at the camera. He was looking at her, checking her expression before he let his own face settle into that smile. I sat down on the floor of my closet with that photo in my hand and let myself remember things I'd spent 2 years explaining away. There was the dinner Thurman canceled 3 days before, the spring before last, saying work had gotten busy with a big restoration job downtown. I remembered being disappointed but not suspicious, because Caleb had said the same thing about work being busy, and it made sense coming from both of them. I never once considered that maybe only one of those excuses was true. There was the time at Easter when his phone buzzed at the table and I watched him go pale reading whatever was on the screen, excuse himself, and come back 10 minutes later looking like he'd aged 5 years in the hallway. I remembered asking if everything was all right. He'd said allergies were bothering him. His eyes were just watering. I believed him because I wanted to. Caleb came home from checking the job site that afternoon and found me still sitting on the closet floor, photos spread out around me like evidence in a case I hadn't known I was building. He sat down heavily beside me and told me something I didn't know, that almost 2 years ago, Thurman had pulled back from the day-to-day decisions at the company almost overnight. Before that, Thurman had wanted a say in every hire, every contract, every material order. Then, seemingly out of nowhere, he started deferring everything, telling Caleb to just handle it, that he trusted his judgment. Caleb said he'd taken it as a compliment at the time, a son finally letting his father lead again. We sat there together, both of us quiet, doing the same math from two different directions, and landing on the same terrible sum. 2 years, Caleb said finally. It's been 2 years, and we called it him growing up. I thought about the debt Thurman confessed to at the party. 3 years ago, he'd said. The money pulled and quietly replaced before anyone noticed. And then Charisse finding out about it 2 years ago. I'd been treating that discovery like the beginning of something. Sitting there with photographs spread across my closet floor, I understood for the first time that it wasn't the beginning at all. It was just the moment she decided to start using what she found. Everything before that, the withdrawal at the company, the canceled dinners, the way his laugh had gotten smaller and smaller at family dinners. All of it had been building for longer than either of us had let ourselves notice. I picked the birthday photo back up and looked at it one more time before I set it aside. Whatever this had cost my son, it had been costing him far longer than 2 years of silence. It had been costing him since the day she found out exactly what kind of leash she was holding. I knew Charisse had a standing hair appointment every other Saturday morning, so I asked Thurman if he'd come help me with a loose porch railing that same weekend, timing it so it would just be the three of us, him, me, and Caleb, somewhere in the background, pretending to be busy with something else. He said yes, without hesitation, which told me something on its own. If he'd needed to check with Charisse first the way he had over Sunday dinner, he didn't mention it. Maybe her being out of the house made it easier. Maybe it just hadn't come up yet. He showed up right on time that Saturday morning, toolbox in hand, and for the first 20 minutes, it felt almost normal. He tightened the railing bolts, told me a story about a client who wanted her whole kitchen redone twice because she couldn't decide on a backsplash, laughed at his own joke the way he used to before any of this. Caleb stayed inside, moving around the kitchen within earshot, close enough to watch through the window without making it obvious he was watching at all. I asked Thurman, careful and light, how things were going with him and Charisse lately. He kept working on the railing, didn't look up right away. Good, he said. Busy. She's got a lot going on with her family's foundation stuff. I asked if he was happy. It wasn't a hard question, or shouldn't have been, but he paused with the wrench still in his hand for a second longer than felt natural before he answered. Course I am, Ma. Why wouldn't I be? I didn't push. I'd promised myself I wouldn't push, not yet. Not until we had more than instinct to work with. I asked him instead if he wanted to stay for lunch after he finished. Told him I'd made a pot of red beans, his favorite since he was a boy. He said that sounded good. Said he didn't have anywhere to be until later that afternoon. His phone buzzed on the porch step where he'd set it down. I watched him go still before he even looked at it. Not curious, still. Not the way anyone glances at a buzzing phone. His whole body reacted first, shoulders tightening, hand already reaching, before his eyes had even confirmed who it was. He picked it up, and I swear he didn't check the screen before he stood up and started gathering his tools back into the toolbox. I gotta head out, he said. Something came up. I asked what came up. Kept my voice easy, like it was nothing. He said it was nothing, just something with the job site. Needed to swing by and check on a delivery. He hadn't looked at the phone again since that first buzz. He didn't need to. Whatever that sound meant to him, his body already knew the answer before his mind caught up. He hugged me goodbye at the door, told me he'd take a rain check on the red beans, and was in his truck and backing out of the driveway inside of 4 minutes. Caleb came out onto the porch and stood beside me, both of us watching Thurman's truck disappear down the street. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. I'd spent the last 4 days telling myself this was something that happened to my son 2 years ago and had been sitting there ever since, an old wound we were only now getting around to noticing. Standing on that porch, watching how fast a single buzz from his pocket could empty every ounce of ease out of his shoulders, I understood the truth of it for the first time. This wasn't something that happened to him once. This was happening to him right now, today, in real time, every single time that phone made a sound. Caleb waited until Monday morning to make the call, sitting at our kitchen table with a legal pad in front of him, like he was preparing for something bigger than a phone conversation. I asked him who he was calling. He said Reggie Fontenette, a forensic accountant he'd worked with years back on an insurance dispute for the company, someone outside our usual bookkeeping entirely. Not the accountant who handled Boswick and Sons' regular filings. Someone with no ties to Thurman, no ties to Charisse, nobody who'd think twice about keeping this quiet. I asked why it mattered that it be someone outside the company. Caleb set the pad down and looked at me the way he does when he's already thought something through 3 times before saying it out loud. Because if I call our regular guy and ask him to look at Thurman's distributions, word gets around eventually. People talk. I need someone who owes me nothing and knows nobody. We drove to Reggie's office that afternoon, a small suite above a bakery on Magazine Street that smelled like coffee even through the front door. Reggie was younger than I expected, sharp-eyed, the kind of man who listens more than he talks. Caleb laid it out plainly. He didn't dress it up as a routine audit, didn't pretend this was ordinary business. He told Reggie straight that he wanted a discreet, private review of his son's personal distribution history from the company over the last 2 years, and that it needed to stay between the 3 of us. Reggie asked the obvious question. Why hadn't anything unusual shown up in the regular books already, if there was something to find? Caleb explained it the way he'd explained it to me the night before. When he and Thurman set up the partnership years ago, they'd built it so each of them had full authority over their own distribution share. Neither one needed the other's sign-off to move his portion of the profits wherever he wanted. It had felt like trust back then. A father telling his son, "You don't need my permission to spend what's yours." That's exactly why nothing ever flagged, Caleb said. If Thurman moved money out of his own share, the books don't care where it went. They only care that the total adds up. And it always added up. Reggie nodded slowly, already reaching for a notepad of his own. He said that kind of structure was common enough between family partners, and common enough for exactly this reason. It's built on trust. And trust doesn't ask questions. A forensic review wouldn't look at whether the numbers balanced. It would look at where the money actually went, cross-referenced against what a reasonable person's spending should look like. That kind of work, he warned us, wasn't quick. Real forensic tracing across 2 years of records could take weeks, not days, if it was going to hold up to any scrutiny later. I sat quiet through most of it, watching my husband explain something I don't think he'd fully admitted to himself until he said it out loud in front of a stranger. That the very trust he'd built into that partnership was the exact same trust that let 2 years of this go unnoticed, sitting right under both our noses the entire time. Reggie asked for access to Thurman's distribution records going back 3 years. Said he'd need several weeks before he had anything solid to bring us, not something he could rush without risking getting it wrong. Caleb handed him a folder of documents he'd already quietly pulled together from the company's files. Bank statements, distribution logs, records. Thurman himself had never had reason to think anyone would ever look at twice. We left Reggie's office a little after 4 that afternoon. Neither of us said much on the drive home. There wasn't anything left to say that hadn't already been said in that room. 3 weeks later, my phone rang. It was Reggie, his voice careful in a way it hadn't been in his office. "Mrs. Boswick, I think you and your husband should come by. There's something in these numbers that doesn't sit right." Reggie's office looked different this time. 3 weeks had passed since we'd handed him that folder, and his desk now held a spreadsheet printed out in tight rows of numbers, covered in yellow sticky notes. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. He turned the laptop screen toward us before we'd even sat down. "I want to walk you through why this took 2 years to surface," he said, "because you're going to ask, and it matters." He pulled up the distribution structure first, the same thing Caleb had explained in his own words days earlier, but seeing it laid out on Reggie's screen made it land differently. Each partner's share moved independently, no cross-check, no flag raised as long as the total on the books matched what should have gone out. Thurman's distributions had gone out exactly as scheduled, every quarter, right on time. The books had no reason to blink. "The company's books were never lying to you," Reggie said. "They just weren't built to ask where the money went after it left, only where it came from and how much." Then he turned to the second sheet, the one with the sticky notes. He'd spent those 3 weeks cross-referencing Thurman's distribution amounts against a rough estimate of his known spending. His mortgage, his truck payment, the ordinary cost of a life like his. The numbers didn't hold together. A meaningful piece of what should have accumulated in Thurman's personal accounts over the last 2 years simply wasn't there. "It's moving somewhere," Reggie said. "I can see it leaving Thurman's side of things clean as day in his own statements he gave us access to. What I can't do, not with what I have, is confirm whose name sits on the other end. That's not something I have legal reach to pull. But the pattern leaving is regular, monthly, sometimes more." Caleb went very still beside me, the kind of still I recognized from the ride home the night of the party. I watched his jaw work before he spoke. "It's her," he said. "It's Charisse." Reggie was careful, said he understood the assumption but couldn't confirm it from where he sat. But Caleb wasn't really asking a question. Something in him had already decided, and I understood why. Everything Thurman told him in that hallway, the debt, the leverage, 2 years of control, this lined up with every word of it. I felt something shift in myself too, watching my husband's hands curl into fists on the arms of his chair. For weeks now, all my anger had nowhere to land except back on my own blindness. Watching those numbers on Reggie's screen, I felt it move for the first time toward the person who actually deserved it. Caleb wanted to drive straight to Thurman and Charisse's house that same evening, wave the printout in her face, demand she account for every dollar. I put my hand on his arm before he could stand up from the chair. "Not yet," I said. "A pattern isn't proof of whose account that is. If we go over there now with half of what we know, she'll have time to cover whatever's left to cover." He didn't like it. I didn't like it either, if I'm honest. But I'd spent weeks learning that acting too fast was exactly how we'd missed 2 years of this in the first place. Reggie clicked to a final tab on his spreadsheet. One transfer highlighted in yellow, dated 11 months back, larger than the rest. "This one," he said, tapping the screen. "This is the one worth handing to someone who can legally dig further than I'm able to." Reggie gave us a name before we left his office that day. Said, if we wanted to know who was actually behind that account, we'd need someone who worked outside the numbers entirely. Someone who could put eyes on a person without that person ever knowing they were being watched. He wrote a name and number on the back of one of his business cards. Junius Calloway. Caleb called him that same night. Junius didn't ask many questions on the phone, just told us to come by his office the next morning. A modest space above a shuttered barbershop near Ferret Street. Nothing fancy. A man who clearly let his work speak instead of his surroundings. He listened to everything. The party, the hallway, the confession, Reggie's findings, without interrupting once, writing in a small notebook the whole time. When Caleb finished, Junius set the notebook down and looked at both of us steady. "I want to be clear about something before I take this on," he said. "I document. I don't confront. I don't warn anybody. I don't tip my hand. And I want to be honest about my limits too. I can't pull anybody's bank statements. Nobody legally can. Not without a court order. What I can do is find the paper trail people leave without meaning to. Filings, property, names attached to things they thought nobody would ever cross-reference." Caleb said that was exactly what we needed. I appreciated that Junius said it plainly, because some small part of me had been afraid Caleb might want more than that, might want confrontation dressed up as investigation. Junius drawing that line himself made it easier to trust him with what came next. He asked for anything we had on Cherise beyond her name, her family's foundation work, her usual routines, anywhere she might have property or business filings, under names other than her married one. Caleb mentioned her maiden name without me even having to ask, something I hadn't thought to consider until Junius brought it up. Cherise had kept some connections to her family's charitable foundation even after marrying into ours, and Junius said that was often exactly where people hid things in plain sight. Inside legitimate-looking structures nobody thought to question. Over the following days, Junius stayed quiet, and so did we. Caleb went back to running the company like nothing had changed, forcing himself through meetings with Thurman where neither of them said a single word about what either of them now knew, the other one knew. I went about my own days the same as always, careful never to let anything in my voice suggest I was watching for anything at all. Cherise, as far as either of us could tell, noticed nothing. She posted about the foundation's spring gala, hosted a lunch for board members at her house, moved through her days with the same easy confidence she always carried. Junius called on a Thursday evening, a little over 2 weeks after we'd first sat in his office. "I found something," he said. "A single-member LLC filed under her maiden name, opened about 2 years back. Registered address is a P.O. box, not her home. It owns a small investment account through a brokerage. That much is public record once I trace the LLC's filings. I can't tell you every dollar that's moved through it, but I can tell you it exists. It's hers alone, and it wasn't there before 2 years ago." I asked him what came next, since he couldn't see inside it himself. He was quiet a second. "Now you take this to a lawyer," he said. "Once this is a legal matter, they can get a subpoena and see the rest. What I've given you is the door. I can't open it any further than this." Junius called 2 days after telling us about the account, and this time his voice had none of the calm certainty from before. "We need to slow down," he said. "Something happened." He'd been parked near Thurman and Cherise's street twice that week. Careful, different spot each time, nothing that should have drawn a second look from anybody. But Cherise noticed anyway. Junius said he watched her come out to get her mail the second time, pause at the curb, and look directly at his car for longer than a passing glance should ever last. Not panicked, not rattled, just measuring it, the way you'd measure anything you intended to remember. Caleb asked how he could be sure it meant anything. Maybe she was just a woman noticing an unfamiliar car on her own street. Nothing more than that. Junius said he'd thought the same thing after the first time. It was the second time that told him otherwise. She'd looked at his car with the specific attention of someone cross-referencing it against something, the same way you'd recognize a number on caller ID you'd seen once before and filed away. I felt my stomach tighten hearing that, because it lined up with something I already knew about her and hadn't thought much of at the time. Thurman had told me himself, weeks back on that phone call, that Cherise kept close track of who called him and when. A woman who tracks incoming calls that closely isn't the kind of woman who lets an unfamiliar car pass through her memory without a second thought. "She doesn't know what she's looking at," Junius said, "but she's looking." That's the part that worries me. Caleb wanted to push forward anyway, said we were close enough now that pulling back felt like losing ground we couldn't get back. I understood the instinct. Every day we waited was another day Thurman spent under her hand, another day of him flinching at his own phone. But I kept thinking about what Sable would likely tell us if we asked her right now, and what Reggie's numbers actually proved on their own. A traced account and an unfamiliar car weren't enough yet to protect Thurman from what would happen if Charisse realized exactly what we were building before we were ready to use it. I asked Junius directly what he thought we should do. He was quiet for a second before he answered. "Pull back. Not stop. Pull back. Give her a week, maybe 2. Where nothing she notices gives her anything new to notice. Let her decide it was nothing. People talk themselves out of suspicion faster than you'd think if you don't feed it." Caleb didn't like it, but he didn't argue either, not really. He sat at our kitchen table that evening with his hands flat on the surface, staring at nothing. And I recognized that stillness now for what it was. Not calm. Just a man forcing himself to wait when every instinct in him wanted to move. We didn't call Reggie that week. Didn't call Sable. Junius stayed away from that street entirely, and Caleb kept his conversations with Thurman at the office as ordinary and unremarkable as he could manage. No lingering glances, no questions that hadn't been asked 100 times before under normal circumstances. I found myself watching my own phone more closely that week too, half expecting Charisse to call under some pleasant pretext, testing the waters the way she tested everything. She never did. Whatever she'd noticed, whatever she suspected, she kept it to herself, same as she'd kept everything else to herself for 2 years. But I understood something clearly by the end of that week that I hadn't let myself accept before. We weren't the only ones paying close attention anymore, and a woman who'd controlled every detail of my son's life for 2 years without a single misstep wasn't going to stay confused for long. 2 weeks after Junius told us to pull back, he called again to say the street had gone quiet. No more strange looks from Charisse, no lingering glances at parked cars. Whatever suspicion she'd carried had settled back down, the way suspicion does when nothing feeds it. That was when Caleb said it was time to talk to a lawyer. Sable Winterbourne's office sat on the second floor of an old building near Lafayette Square, dark wood and quiet efficiency. She'd come recommended through a friend of Caleb's from the Chamber of Commerce, someone who handled exactly this kind of case, without needing to advertise that she did. She listened the way Junius had, without interrupting, taking notes in a hand so neat it looked typed. When we finished, she set her pen down and folded her hands on the desk. "Based on everything you've described, you likely have 2 separate problems here," she said. "And I want you to understand them as 2 separate problems, because the courts will treat them that way even if it doesn't feel that way to you." She explained the first carefully. What Charisse appeared to be doing with the money, using knowledge of Thurman's debt to control his distributions, funds apparently moving toward an LLC tied to her maiden name, could meet the legal definition of extortion under Louisiana law, if the pattern held up under scrutiny. The threat didn't have to be violent to count. The law didn't care whether the secret she held over him was true. What mattered was whether she'd used the threat of exposing it to compel him to hand over something he wouldn't have given up otherwise. The second problem was separate, she said, just as serious, though further along in terms of what could actually be proven. What Caleb witnessed in that hallway, his hand twisted into Thurman's tie, the fear on his face, could fall under domestic abuse battery, its own charge, its own process, its own timeline in court. two different statutes, she said. Likely two different prosecutions if this moves forward. They can run in parallel, but they won't move as one. Caleb asked how fast we could file, now that we had Reggie's findings and the filing Junius had traced. Sable was quiet a moment before she answered, choosing her words carefully. What you've given me is a real pattern worth pursuing, she said. But a pattern isn't the same as proof, and neither is the same as a witness. Right now, I have documents pointing at something. I don't have your son's voice anywhere in this. Without that, a defense attorney could tear a lot of this apart in an afternoon. Say the money was a gift. Say the LLC is unrelated to any of it. Say the hallway was a private disagreement between a husband and wife. That's none of anyone's business. I felt the weight of that settle over the room. Caleb leaned forward, jaw tight. So we wait again, he said, not really a question. Not indefinitely, Sable said. But yes, I need your son on record before I can file anything formally. Everything else supports his account. None of it replaces it. Caleb wanted to push harder, said every week we waited was another week Thurman spent under her control. Sable didn't disagree with the urgency. She just said urgency without a witness willing to speak was a case that could collapse the moment it was tested. I sat between the two of them, understanding both truths at once. My husband's fear that waiting cost us something real, and Sable's certainty that moving without Thurman risked losing everything. Sable closed her folder and looked at both of us steady. I can build one of the strongest cases I've handled in years, she said, and it still won't matter much if your son isn't ready to stand behind it. That's not a legal problem I can solve for you. That's a conversation only the two of you can have with him. We left her office with a plan that depended entirely on something none of us could control. Whether Thurman, after 2 years of silence, was finally ready to speak. I found out Charisse had a work conference in Baton Rouge, 2 nights away, from something Thurman mentioned in passing on a call about Sunday dinner. He said it easy, like it meant nothing. To me, it meant everything. It meant a window. I called him the morning she left, told him I wanted to bring by some of his grandmother's old recipe cards I'd been meaning to pass down. He said, sure, come by that evening. Caleb came with me, quiet the whole drive over, the way he gets when he's saving his words for something that matters more than small talk. Thurman opened the door, looking lighter than I'd seen him in months, the particular ease of a man alone in his own house for once. That ease didn't last long once we sat down at his kitchen table and I set the recipe cards aside without opening them. We need to talk to you, I said. Really talk. He went still. I didn't accuse him of anything. I didn't raise my voice. I just told him plainly what we knew. Reggie's numbers, the account under his wife's maiden name, the pattern of transfers going back 2 years. I watched his face while I spoke, watched something in him crack open that had been sealed shut since that hallway. Ma, his voice broke on the single word. I'm not here to be angry at you, I said. I already know enough. I need you to tell me the rest, yourself. He put his head down on the table for a long moment. Caleb didn't say anything, didn't reach for him, just stayed close, steady, present in a way that told Thurman he wasn't facing this alone. When Thurman finally lifted his head, what came out of him wasn't a confession so much as a flood. Pieces coming loose faster than he could arrange them. The debt, 3 years back. Money he'd been too ashamed to ever bring to his father directly. Charisse, finding the proof. The first time she brought it up, calm, almost gentle, telling him she'd take care of it. She'd handle it so nobody else ever had to know. It didn't feel like a threat at first, he said. It felt like she was protecting me. Then, slowly, how that protection turned into control. How she started managing his distributions, so he wouldn't be tempted again. How she started handling his calendar, his phone, just to keep things organized. How every time he tried to push back, she reminded him softly. What would happen if his father ever found out what kind of son he really was? And when soft didn't work? I asked. His hands were shaking on the table. She'd get her hands on me. Not always hard, just enough to remind me she could. I felt something break loose in my own chest, hearing him say it in his own words. Plain and unguarded. Nothing like the rushed whisper he'd given Caleb in that hallway. This was the whole shape of it finally. Spoken instead of confessed, under pressure. I asked him if he was willing to say all of this to someone who could actually help him. Not confront Charisse, not warn her. Just tell the truth, on record, to people trained to protect him while he did it. He was quiet a long time, hands still trembling where they rested on the table. I don't know if I can, he said. Then, softer, barely audible. But I don't know if I can keep living like this either. That wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a no. Thurman called me 2 days after Charisse came home from Baton Rouge, his voice tight in a way I hadn't heard since, before that kitchen table conversation. She knows something's off, he said. I don't know how much. He told me she'd gone through his phone the night she got back, same as always, checking his call log the way she always did. But this time, she'd found something she couldn't explain away easily. A call to his mother, over 40 minutes long, logged the same evening she'd been gone. Far longer than the quick, easy check-ins she was used to seeing between us. She hadn't said a word about it that night. That was what scared him most. If she'd asked me straight out, I'd have known what to say, he told me. She didn't ask anything. She just got quiet. Sweet, almost. Asked me if I was doing all right. If I felt like she'd been neglecting me lately. If there was anything on my mind. Over the next several days, he said. It kept going that way. Not threats. Not her hands on him again. Just a soft, constant current of guilt, reminding him how hard she worked to protect their life together, how much she'd sacrificed keeping his mistake quiet all this time, how a family like his would never look at him the same if certain things came out. She cried once, he said. Told him she didn't know what she'd do if he ever stopped trusting her. It's working on me, Ma, he admitted, voice breaking. I keep thinking maybe this isn't worth blowing everything up over. Maybe I should just let it go. I felt my own chest tighten hearing that, but I didn't raise my voice, didn't tell him he was being foolish. Caleb, sitting beside me at the table with the phone on speaker, shook his head slowly, jaw tight, but he stayed quiet too. I understand why she's gotten to you, I told Thurman. That's exactly what she's good at. But nothing you just described to us is new information. It's the same thing she's been doing for 2 years, just softer than usual, because she doesn't know what we know yet. He didn't answer right away. I could hear him breathing on the other end, unsteady. Caleb finally spoke, his voice calmer than I expected. Nobody's going to think less of you if you need more time, he said. But don't let her talk you into believing this was ever your shame to carry alone. We called Sable that same evening, told her what was happening. She wasn't rattled by it, said this exact kind of wavering was common, almost expected, in cases like this. That it didn't mean the case was falling apart, only that Thurman needed steadier ground under him before moving forward. She said we could wait. Not indefinitely, but we could wait. I called Thurman back the next morning, told him there was no deadline hanging over him, no one keeping score of how long it took him to feel ready. I told him he didn't have to decide anything that day. He was quiet a long moment before he answered. I don't want to keep living scared of my own phone, he said finally. I want to finish what I started at your kitchen table. It wasn't confident. It wasn't certain. But it was enough. Thurman gave his full statement to Sable a week after that phone call, sitting in her office with his hands folded tight in his lap, going through everything a second time, this time on record. I sat beside him. Caleb stood by the window, arms crossed, silent the whole hour. Sable moved fast after that. The same day, she filed for a temporary protective order on Thurman's behalf. The kind a judge can grant quickly, without Charisse present, meant to hold until a full hearing could be scheduled. At the same time, she referred the extortion and battery evidence to a detective she trusted, explaining to us plainly that track would move slower. Police review, then a district attorney's office deciding whether to bring charges. 2 separate systems, 2 separate speeds, both now finally in motion. Sable called 2 days later to say the temporary order had been granted, and Charisse served that morning with a full hearing set for 3 weeks out to decide whether it would extend further. She warned us there's often a narrow window, a few hours at most, before an order like this is fully entered into the system and enforceable at the workplace itself. Thurman called me an hour after that, voice unsteady in a way that told me the call hadn't gone well before he said a word. "She came to the office," he said, "right after she got served. I've never seen her like that." He said she hadn't screamed, not exactly, but her voice had gone sharp and low, the kind of angry that doesn't need volume to cut. She'd cornered him near the break room, asked him how he could do this to her after everything she'd done to protect him. Asked him if he understood what he was throwing away. The marriage, the life they'd built, the story everyone at the office would tell about him now. She kept saying, "You didn't actually think this would work, did you?" Thurman said, like she genuinely couldn't believe I'd gone through with it. That struck something in me, hearing it. 2 years of assuming his fear would hold forever, and here, it hadn't. I could hear it in what he described, not just anger, but disbelief. The particular fury of someone whose control had never once failed before. Caleb wanted to drive to the office himself, make sure Thurman wasn't alone with her again before the order fully took effect. I told him Sable needed to handle this part, that showing up ourselves risked looking exactly like the kind of retaliation a defense attorney could use against us later. He didn't like it, but he didn't argue. Sable called that evening to confirm the temporary order was now fully active and logged. Charisse legally barred from contacting Thurman directly, from coming near his workplace, from any of it, starting immediately, with the full hearing still ahead. She noted the earlier office visit for the file as context, even though it had landed just outside the order's enforceable window, and said Chariss's reaction, unsettling as it sounded, wasn't unusual either. People who've held control this completely for this long rarely take its loss quietly. "She's not done," Sable said. "Someone like this doesn't just accept a piece of paper and walk away. Watch for her to test the boundaries, one way or another, before that hearing." I hung up the phone that night and sat for a long while in the quiet of my own kitchen, the same table where Caleb had once asked me if I'd seen it too. So much had happened between that night and this one. And yet, listening to Sable's warning still ringing in my ears, I understood we hadn't reached anything close to an ending yet. Somewhere across town, Charisse was sitting with a piece of paper that told her, for the first time in 2 years, that she wasn't in control of this anymore. I didn't know yet what she'd do with that. None of us did. Thurman called me 5 days after the protective order was served, his voice strange, careful, like he was handling something fragile. "She called me," he said. "She's not supposed to." I didn't answer, but she left a voicemail. I told him not to delete it, not to do anything with it until Sable had heard it herself. He said he hadn't touched it, just sat staring at his phone for 20 minutes before he could bring himself to call me. Sable had us bring the phone straight to her office that afternoon. She played the voicemail once through, all of us silent around her desk. Cherise's voice came through soft at first, almost pleading, telling Thurman she missed him, that she didn't understand how they'd gotten here, that she hoped he knew none of this had to happen if he'd just talked to her instead of hiding behind lawyers. Then, near the end, her tone shifted. Still calm, still even, but colder. "You know what happens to people who make things difficult for no reason," she said before the message cut off. Sable sat back in her chair, something sharpening in her expression. "That's not just a violation of the order," she said. "That's evidence. A recorded, time-stamped statement, made in direct violation of a court order, containing language a jury could reasonably read as a threat. This helps us more than it hurts her." She said she'd be turning the recording over to the detective handling the criminal side immediately. A new violation on top of everything already under review. One that showed a pattern rather than a single incident. She also told us she'd used what Junius had already found, the LLC filed under Cherise's maiden name, to get a subpoena issued for the account records behind it, since that kind of legal reach was exactly what none of us had on our own. A few weeks later, Reggie called and asked us to come by his office one more time. Between the subpoenaed account records and Thurman's own statements, he'd finished his full forensic review, cross-referencing every distribution, every transfer, every dollar that had moved out of Thurman's share over 2 years. He turned his laptop toward us and read the number out loud before he even showed it to us on the screen. Caleb didn't say anything for a long moment after Reggie said the total. I felt my own breath catch, hearing exactly how much of my son's life had been quietly siphoned away, dollar by dollar, while the rest of us assumed everything was fine. "This is documented, traceable, and now confirmed against the account records themselves," Reggie said. "There's no ambiguity left in these numbers." We weren't hiding any of this anymore. Caleb started coming to every meeting with Sable, sitting beside Thurman instead of watching from a careful distance. Sunday dinners became something else now. Strategy sessions disguised as family meals. Sable's number saved in all of our phones. Reggie's findings printed and organized in a folder Caleb kept on the seat of his truck. Sable called nearly 2 months later to tell us the DA's office had finished reviewing everything, the original hallway account, the financial pattern, and the voicemail, and had decided to move forward with formal charges on both counts. "This is as strong a case as I've built in years," she said. "Extortion, documented dollar for dollar, battery, corroborated by a witness, and now a recorded threat. We're not settling for anything less than trial." Thurman was quiet on the call, but I heard something in his breathing that hadn't been there in months. Not relief exactly, something closer to it. Months later, in a courtroom on Poydras Street, I sat between Caleb and Reggie, watching my son walk to the witness stand in a suit I'd ironed myself that morning because he'd asked me to, said it was the one thing that still felt like his mother taking care of him. Sable had warned us it would be hard to watch. She hadn't warned us it would be this hard. Thurman's voice shook at first, answering her opening questions about his marriage, the debt, the day Cherise found proof of it. But something steadied in him as he kept going, like each sentence cost him less than the one before it. He described the first time she'd offered to handle it for him, how gentle it had sounded at the time. He described the calendar, the phone checks, the slow disappearance of his own decisions from his own life. He described the hallway at her birthday party, his father's face when he asked him what was wrong, and the 2 years that had built up to that single moment of breaking. The defense tried to paint it as a marriage disagreement, nothing more. A wife managing a household the way wives sometimes do. Thurman didn't raise his voice answering their questions. He didn't need to. He simply told the truth again, plainer the second time, and I watched 2 jurors glance at each other in a way that told me they'd already made up their minds. Reggie testified after him, walking the jury through the account records the subpoena had finally opened up. The same careful precision he'd shown us in his office that first afternoon. Junius testified to what he'd documented, careful and factual, exactly as he'd promised us he would be from the start. The voicemail played once in that courtroom, Sharice's own recorded voice delivering her own undoing. The verdict came back after 2 days of deliberation. Guilty on both counts, extortion, battery. Sable filed the civil suit the same week, using the conviction itself as grounds to recover what Sharice had taken. And months later, that case settled. Sharice's claim to any part of Boswick and Sons signed away entirely. Thurman's ownership restored in full, clean, and untouchable. I didn't feel triumphant hearing the verdict read aloud. I felt something quieter than that. Something closer to relief. And underneath the relief, a grief I don't think I'll ever fully put down. Grief for 2 years I can't get back. 2 years I spent explaining away every sign because it was easier than believing my son could be afraid in his own home. I think about that party often now. The birthday cake we never got to eat. My husband's hand closing around mine under that table, urgent, wordless. I used to think I knew everything worth knowing about the people I love most. I don't believe that anymore, not in the same easy way. I've learned to look a little longer now, to ask a second question when the first answer comes too smooth, too fast. Thurman came to dinner last Sunday for the first time in longer than I want to admit. He laughed at something Caleb said, really laughed. The kind I hadn't heard from him in 2 years. He stayed late, helped me clear the table, told me about a new restoration job downtown he was excited about in a way he hadn't been excited about anything in longer than I could remember. Watching him from across my own kitchen, I understood that the case was over, but the healing was only just beginning. And for the first time in 2 years, I believed my son had every reason to keep going.